The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. So I'm excited to get into today's episode and introduce my guest. I did say when I initially recorded my introduction to this podcast that, one of the underpinning themes and aims were to explore paradigms of health and well-being and performance. But importantly, to do that through the lens of science, but also appreciating there's an art to practice. And then this idea of underpinning ancient wisdom. I feel very strongly as a clinician that I should be looking for the best evidence available to me, particularly in terms of scientific, rigorous research. But I'm also conscious that there can be real challenges to finding, that gold standard of the randomized, controlled, blinded clinical trial. And then even when you do have that gold standard, it can be challenging to then translate that into clinical practice for communities and for individuals. I am also an emergency physician and I'm aware that in many areas in resuscitation, for example, it can be very difficult to do that high standard of quality research. Many of the conditions that we are dealing with occur so infrequently. The same applies in many aspects of lifestyle intervention. If you were to study pillars of health like diet and exercise and sleep and stress management and explore the impact of them as potentially preventative in health or as treatments, it can be very difficult. We often rely on observational data, so self-reports, questionnaires, looking at populations, either retrospectively or prospectively, and then interpreting that data with, all the potential confounding variables. So today I'm delighted that we're actually going to be talking to a scientist who is not only doing exciting and impressive research, but really looking at how we translate that into practice.
Even before COVID, we saw a massive spike in presentations to the emergency facility at the hospital owing to mental health. So we sort of saw a lull during lockdown and then we've seen a spike again. So we need to get more resourceful and inventive, I think, in the ways that we can offer, whether it's adjunctive or support to clients who might be on a wait list to see a psychologist or they're in a rural setting and they can't get access to a psychiatrist or whatever it might be. So we're really keen on the idea that upskilling or providing an additional kind of, workforce option within the mental health care system could actually be a really important way of alleviating a lot of the burden that is not just present now, but the implications of COVID, but financially and socioeconomically are going to be seen now for many years to come.
You've just been listening to today's guest, who I'm excited to welcome to the podcast, Associate Professor Adrienne O'Neill. So Adrienne is the Director of Heart and Mind Research at Impact at Deakin in Victoria. And for well over a decade, she has been researching the link between mental and cardiovascular health. A key part of that work has been investigating the role, particularly that lifestyle plays in the onset and outcomes of depression and cardiovascular disease. More recently, she has been appointed as the Deputy Director of the Food and Mood Centre, and she works alongside Professor Felice Jacka, who is the Director of the Centre. So Adrienne was one of the lead authors on a now landmark study conducted here in Australia called the SMILES trial, which was one of the first studies, clinical studies, looking at a dietary intervention as a potential, what we call adjunctive, so in addition to usual treatment, in the treatment of depression. And that had a very promising positive result, which has since been replicated. So we'll talk about the SMILES trial today. And we have mentioned that on the podcast before in my conversation with Dr. Greta Pozeski in season 1, episode 2. Greta is a GP and fellow of the Australian College of Lifestyle Medicine. As a behavioural scientist, though, Adrienne's main research interest is in how we translate research into practice. And I think, as a clinician, that is what is most interesting to me. Not only how we give clinicians skills to use research information, but also how we then translate that to patients. And Adrienne's other particular focus is on how we do that, given the numerous challenges that we can have when you apply that to, for example, particularly resource poor environments, populations, communities, and individuals. And much of our conversation today will be focused around just this. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Thank you, Adrienne. I am delighted to welcome you to the podcast this morning. Thank you for making time for this. I initially reached out to yourself and Professor Felice Jacka about your work at the Food and Mood Centre. We have spoken about the SMILES trial before on this podcast, and certainly, lifestyle medicine has been a component of that, and that translation of science and art and into practice. But when I actually went deeper into your work and your bio, I became quite excited because you have done a lot of work in the fields of cardiovascular health and mental health and mind-body connection. And it took me back to, my undergraduate days. I worked with a cardiologist in Paisley, who's actually here in Hobart now as well. We have both ended up on this side of the world. And he was interested in sports, exercise, lifestyle medicine. And that was my intercalated degree. And we did a study funded by the Scottish Executive, Have a Heart Paisley, looking at primary and secondary prevention of coronary heart disease at that point. And, we brought in many of the things that we might visit today. So it's kind of really the evolution of that, the science and the rigor in the science and how we translate it. I'm really fascinated to learn from you because I know that you're pretty much at the cutting edge of that, which is, it's fantastic. And I think this audience will be very interested in that. I'd like to begin by asking, now, if I understand rightly, you're the Director of Heart and Mind and the Deputy Director of the Food and Mood Centre at Deakin, but you're a behavioural scientist, is that right? Can you tell me a bit about how you find yourself in this space and what that looks like for you on a day-to-day practice in terms of your research and also the kind of clinical application of it?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me today, Cheryl. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I've found myself on a really interesting journey over the last sort of 15 years that I have been in medical research. So as you say, I started off in the field of diabetes prevention largely and looking at cardiovascular disease as well. So one of the first jobs that I ever had was down in country Victoria at Deakin and Flinders University in a Department of Rural Health led by a Scot by the name of Professor James Dunbar. He was really, really pivotal in applying lifestyle interventions for diabetes prevention. And what we had down at the department at the time was a cohort of Finnish researchers who in the early 2000s had done a lot of work, pivotal work demonstrating that a structured lifestyle modification program, when offered to individuals who were at high risk of developing diabetes, was far superior to a metformin or a placebo for reducing the incidence of type 2 diabetes. So over the course of 4 years, this type of a program could reduce the risk of diabetes onset by about 58%. So it was really quite striking findings, and this went on to be replicated in the US, in China, and then eventually in Australia. And so we conducted an implementation trial within a primary care setting to demonstrate that this could feasibly be done. And this was in fact then presented as unique evidence of its kind to state and federal government, and it ended up resulting in about a $200 million investment into diabetes prevention at that time by the Howard government. Yeah. And what we see now is, for any Victorians out there that might be familiar with what's now called the LIFE program, which is offered through the Department of Health and Human Services by Diabetes Victoria to all Victorians who are at high risk of diabetes. So I learned a lot from the early days in my career from that. And then I went on to actually do my PhD in cardiovascular management and looking at these same sorts of lifestyle-based strategies for delivering care after admission for a heart attack. Mm-hmm. So we know that cardiac rehabilitation has long been evidence-based best practice when offered to individuals who have been hospitalised for a heart event. There's all sorts of reasons why referral rates or uptake or completion might be low. So one of the things I was really interested in was how we might be able to bring to the masses these sorts of programs using the telephone back in the mid-2000s.
Oh, interesting.
Really interesting that we've now come full circle with all of this sort of rapid health policy reform in light of COVID. So it's been a really interesting sort of journey from that regard too. So when I arrived at the Food and Mood Centre, when we were about to initiate the SMILES trial, which I can talk to a little bit further, I was stunned to see that the likes of Professor Felice Jacka and Professor Michael Burke, who's our Institute Director, were really leading the charge in their thinking around lifestyle application for the management and potentially prevention of the common mental disorders. And for me, it was so striking that we had decades of evidence that this was best practice in cardiovascular prevention and management and diabetes. We had all of the diabetes trials from efficacy to implementation, and that we had almost nothing in mental health care. And actually, not only did we have very little evidence, but there was a real skepticism within the community about the possible role of lifestyle. And I think a lot of that is because we know that there's a whole host of non-modifiable or perhaps more difficult to modify risk factors, particularly in early life, for mental disorders. So I think it was sort of considered a bit fanciful that this might be the case. And at that stage, we had some really good observational data showing the relationship, particularly between the likes of diet quality and the onset or risk of depression and anxiety. And that has now been replicated across, multiple settings, countries, age groups, what have you. But it was really once we had conducted the SMILES trial, the first intervention study of its kind, to demonstrate the sort of causal role in the treatment of major depressive disorder using a dietary intervention, that this field, I think, really started to sort of propel and be perhaps taken a little bit more seriously.
I'd love to talk a bit about the SMILES trial, since we've mentioned it a few times now, because it really was pivotal. And I know there was a lot of challenges surrounding that as well. Do you mind, we've talked about, the levels of evidence, and this was really in terms of scientific rigor, approaching gold standard in terms of what you would want from a trial and in terms of a clinical trial. Can you tell me about what that looked like in practice? And you mentioned the common mental disorders. This was in depression, is that right? Please tell me a bit about the study.
Certainly. So this was funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council. It was a 3-year trial. What we did was recruited from the general community individuals who had a major depressive disorder. It was designed to be delivered adjunct to the care that they were already receiving. So I think we had might have been 60% of individuals coming into the trial on some sort of a pharmacotherapeutic sort of regimen. So they were randomised to receive, these were all adults over the age of 18. They were randomised to either receive a dietary intervention across the course of a 12-week period, one-on-one with an accredited practicing dietitian, or to a social support condition. And this was essentially the same schedule in terms of amount of contact, but the topics that were discussed in those sessions were sort of very benign. And the whole idea of using a social support control is to control for simply that contact that one might have with an allied health professional, so that we could eliminate any sort of confounding to that extent. So in terms of what the SMILES intervention itself was really providing was face-to-face structured nutritional counselling. We used what we call a ModiMed diet, so a modified Mediterranean diet, which was really adapted from our lead dietitian on the study at the time, Professor Catherine Itsiopoulos, had written her entire PhD applying what we knew from the Mediterranean diet using these 10 commandments of the Mediterranean diet, which of course is, things like high quality fats, eating lots of variety in one's diet, high fibre, fish, nuts, everything that you would expect. Obviously sort of plant-based, lots of fruits and vegetables. So everything that you would expect from a Mediterranean diet, slightly modified to our target population by including a bit of a focus on 3 serves of lean red meat, 2 to 3 serves of lean red meat a week. And that was off the back of some observational evidence that we had generated to show this sort of U-shaped curve between the intake of red meat and depressive disorders in women. And this is probably no great surprise, particularly the cohort that we had coming into the trial, which was sort of largely women between the ages of 30 and 40. So it was slightly modified based on that. We provided food hampers and recipes, really, really practical skills to support the counselling in session. So the idea that at the beginning, particularly at the beginning and then at the end of the program, that they would have access to potentially more expensive things to purchase, like good quality olive oils and nuts and things, and salmon and meat and things, because we didn't want cost or anything like that to be a barrier. And we also provided them, I think really importantly, thinking about the trajectory and the symptomatology of major depressive disorder. One of the things that the accredited practicing dietitians worked on with the participants was this idea of sort of understanding your symptomatology and knowing when, if you are feeling motivated, you're feeling good, then is a really good time to start, say, preparing your meals to pop in the freezer, or, understanding strategies for, relapse prevention and how to actually prepare, to meet your nutritional requirements in the context of your illness. Because if you wake up the next day and you can't bring yourself to get out of bed, then it's going to be very, very difficult for you to prepare a meal. And what we found after we did our assessments on both groups, before and after both of the interventions, we found striking reductions in depressive symptomatology in favour of the dietary intervention group. So much so that we achieved, I think it was a difference of 32% remission rates versus 8% remission rates. So it was largely a function of, once we sort of looked at depression scores against dietary improvement scores, it was largely highly correlated. So we were quite confident when we saw those data that we could say that a large part of this change in an improvement in depression was a function of improving diet quality. And not only did we find those effects over the course of the 12-week program. But we actually conducted a formal cost effectiveness evaluation, which is incredibly important, because I think you would know, Cheryl, that one of the immediate sort of reactions is to say, oh, well, that's great, but what about for those people who can't afford to eat eat well? And we actually found that the Smiles group saved $25 a week than what they were doing before they entered the program. So in terms of their spend on food and discretionary items, they actually ended up better off owing to, buying and using the food and the ingredients in the way that the dietitian had helped them with. And not only that, but the overall costing of the program, when we start to incorporate things like societal gains, so returning to work and productivity, and other costs to the healthcare system, the Smiles program worked out to be about $3,000 Australian dollars per participant cheaper than essentially not doing anything at all. So I think that started to help dispel some of the myths, I think, around the idea that it is incredibly expensive to eat well. I think it's just about helping people to understand how best to maximise what it is that we're purchasing and the use of food, and how to, and understanding, I guess, not only the individual symptom trajectory and those sorts of things, but also understanding the social context of any one person, particularly as we're starting to see the effects of COVID as well, and the implications, I think, more broadly on mental health and the societal kind of issues surrounding that. I think when we talk about lifestyle medicine and what we're asking people to do, we have to be incredibly mindful of those. If someone has poor housing and doesn't have access to, electricity or a freezer or a fridge or what have you, it's up to clinicians to be working in with individuals to allow for that.
Absolutely. And did you do a cost analysis of the cost to have a professional providing this support?
So that was formally costed as part of the economic evaluation, which saw the $3,000 savings to the Smiles intervention. So yes, that was absolutely costed, and that was a really critical component of that.
And I heard you say, as an adjunctive treatment, and then, this is something in addition to standard care, your number needed to treat was something like, was it 1 in 4?
That's right.
Yeah. And from my reading, I understand that the changes that you saw were independent of factors like change in weight, participant self-efficacy, that potentially could have been confounding.
That's right. And I think that is another really important take-home message here, is that all of these changes, improvements in depression, occurred independent of any change in weight. And I think this is something else that I've been looking into a lot more closely, going back on the diabetes prevention literature, because we saw pretty clearly from many of those diabetes prevention project studies that there was this really clear, I guess, dose-response effect with regards to the effect of the lifestyle intervention on weight loss, which then translated to reductions in diabetes incidence. However, I've drilled further down into the literature, and there's also some evidence from the Finnish studies to show that actually, even in the absence of weight loss, increasing fibre and reducing saturated fat in that cohort could still effectively reduce diabetes risk. And this is something that has really been something quite fascinating in terms of when we think about the relationship between mental health and overweight and obesity, and something I think that we've tried to provide a clear and consistent message owing to what we observed within the Smiles trial participants, is that these changes, the benefits are pretty clear, even in the absence of weight loss. So for individuals who really struggle, I think a lot of us would struggle with the idea of an intervention that specifically just targets weight loss. And I think a mental health patient population, when you can say to them, just forget about your weight, just focus on, improving the quality, the variety, things like, your gut health, what have you, focus on that, and you can start to see some positive changes.
I mean, I'm conscious that this is a population who were able to, were well enough to be able to engage in the research. And, Felice talks about the challenges, and you might speak to that, of actually recruiting people for studies like this. And I think she was a bit, it took a while. We eventually got enough people, and I don't think she was expecting the results. I mean, I don't know if you would say the same that you did, which were phenomenal, based on still a relatively small number, but robustly researched. I know there's been subsequent studies in Australia on the back of that. Can you talk about where we've gone from there?
Indeed. So, yeah, absolutely would just echo what Felice has said there. This is a common problem in psychiatric research, particularly when you're looking at community-based recruitment, because you really do rely on getting out there and, essentially offering this sort of a program to anyone that sort of fits the criteria, and I think we've learned a lot from that. And I can speak to some of the subsequent trials, certainly that I'm running, that are much more embedded within existing healthcare systems, which I think is the really important next step.
Yes.
But with respect to replication of SMILES, I'm aware of at least 2 other clinical trials which have been able to replicate our findings. One was the South Australian study, which was a group-based intervention, and that found really similar effects and also cost effectiveness, which I think is really important in terms of thinking about the question that you had around the costing of delivering the intervention, particularly in a one-on-one capacity. So I think the fact that the Healthy Meds trial was able to demonstrate efficacy and cost effectiveness in a group setting is really important from a resourcing point of view, and particularly if we're thinking about scaling up or rolling out an intervention like this. And that's precisely what they did in Finland with the original diabetes prevention studies. So they went from a model which used sort of more one-on-one intensive counselling over about sort of an 8-month period to an implementation rollout of the program that was embedded within sort of regionally, and that was group-based and within the community. So that's really promising. There's also been another study run out of New South Wales, Macquarie University, in a younger cohort of individuals. So it was a university-aged adults, and that was really looking at demonstrating the effects of sort of, I guess, the deleterious effects of an unhealthy diet, and then and that's something, I think that was a brief intervention. I think from memory it was over the course of about 3 weeks perhaps, and that is a really interesting study in itself, because something else that we found when we were analysing the SMILES trial data was that it wasn't just that diet quality improved, which it did. So we saw things like, on average, about an increase of 1 serving of, say, legumes, 1 serving increase of vegetables, fruits, etc., over the course of a week. But our participants had, on average, a reduction of 20 discretionary items over the course of a week. So it's that it's not just what you're eating, it's what you're not eating as well. So I think that is quite a striking finding in and of itself.
And I think, I'm most interested in the prevention space as well. And if I can give simple, I know we're going to go on to talk about the translational part of this, But, I'm very interested in the audience that are potentially at risk that could do simple things that might actually help bolster them as adjunctive. Again, it's part of daily lifestyle.
Absolutely. And I think the thing with mental disorder prevention is that we know that the majority of mental disorders, particularly the common mental disorders, occur before the age of 25. So when you are talking about the prevention space, you are talking about children and young adults, and that that then raises the question about the food environment and what they're exposed to in early life, and that's a very contentious space as well.
I really like that in Felice's book Brain Changer, she does put emphasis on that we really need to think about the food environment, because I do think if we can, nudge people, make it easy to make good choices, then that is very important. I think a few people now, Greta Prozeski is one of the lifestyle medicine GPs who's been on this podcast, has quoted Michael Pollan as well, is eat whole foods, not too much, mostly plants. And, I like Felice's kind of caveat is that just keep it simple. And I think that the population is very overwhelmed about, what should we be eating? How should we be eating? What should we be doing this week when it comes to lifestyle changes that we can make? And I think, as clinicians, it's really important that we are able to give consistent, small, simple messages repeated over time, and people might look to just change one or two things. I'm interested, is there any research happening at population level here in Australia looking at the translation of the messages, looking at the food environment and changes, I suppose a bit like the Blue Zones research?
Yeah, that is something that a very talented postdoctoral researcher by the name of Dr. Erin Hoare, she's leading a stream of research in this area in the prevention space. So she's done a lot of work in community-based interventions in school-aged children. And so I'm aware of, there's a lot of really good work going on in that space. We are, certainly my research program is really focused on, adjunctive treatment strategies. And then I think a lot of the learnings from those, and certainly from what we've seen work and not work in diabetes prevention, are going to be really pivotal in both in the prevention and sort of the treatment space, just because we know about the ways in which innovations are diffused across populations, that individuals who are living in particular areas, in particular neighbourhoods, in particular households, will need more intensive support than those who don't. And Michael Marmot's written a lot about this in terms of the resource allocation that needs to be provided. I think he calls it universal proportionalism, which I think is a really important point. Providing these sorts of interventions in a one-size-fits-all strategy, whether for prevention or treatment purposes, is not going to look the same for everyone, and particularly when you start to look at contextual factors like the environments, whether that be the household, the neighbourhood, or the school environment around that.
And what are you currently working on? And tell me a bit about the work of the Food and Mood Centre itself.
Yeah, that's right. So the Food and Mood Centre is now around 5 years old. We're based at the Impact Institute at Deakin University, which, it's in Geelong in Victoria, so about an hour's drive outside of Melbourne. We are now a centre of about 35 students and researchers. We cover essentially anything to do with nutrition and increasingly lifestyle in terms of determinants and treatment targets for mental disorders, and also looking at things, right across the lifespan from pregnancy and conception right through to old age and healthy ageing. So we've got, 5 streams of research there, and I've mentioned a few of them today. One increasing area of focus for us is microbiome, and that stream is led by Dr. Amy Loftman. But my stream is really focused upon, the translation work. So how do we get what we know sort of works in a rigorous controlled trial setting into how does it have real world application, and how can we get it to work in primary care, in public mental health care, in private practice, what have you. So there's a couple of projects that I'm currently working on. Last year, we were really fortunate enough to receive funding from the Medical Future Research Fund. And that is a trial called the CALM trial, Curbing Anxiety and Depression Using Lifestyle Medicine. Okay. And it's essentially broadening what we learned in the SMILES trial, incorporating what we know worked and didn't work in diabetes prevention and heart disease through cardiac rehabilitation, etc., and applying that to more complex mental disorder management. So we're doing that. We've partnered with Bowen Health Mental Health Drug and Alcohol Service to embed this program within their community public mental health service. And we are just this week starting to recruit for that. And essentially individuals coming into the program will be randomly assigned to either receive this CALM program, which is, again, it's run by accredited practicing dietitians and an exercise physiologist, covering largely nutrition and exercise physiology, but also things like smoking and sleep, etc. And we're actually comparing it to a cognitive behavioural therapy program run by two clinical psychologists. So essentially comparing 2 8-week programs to see whether or not this can alleviate distress, and it also improve chronic disease risk outcomes as well. So we should have the results for that by hopefully around this time next year. So it's an 18-month trial, but that is really, to our knowledge, one of the first studies to embed this type of care within, certainly, locally, certainly within our public mental health service. So it's going to be really interesting to see. We're also looking at doing a process evaluation and a formal cost effectiveness evaluation. And what we actually want to glean from this is this a sort of feasible, effective program that can be a value add to what is actually on offer within public mental health care, in addition to, the psychiatry, the psychology, the social work led programs that are already provided, because this could have massive implications on workforce, particularly, and this was through a COVID mental health scheme that we were successful in obtaining this funding. And I think it's really important, as we see in the Geelong region over the last 3 years. Even before COVID, we saw a massive spike in presentations to the emergency facility at the hospital owing to mental health. So we sort of saw a lull during lockdown, and then we've seen a spike again. So we need to get more resourceful and inventive, I think, in the ways that we can offer, whether it's adjunctive or support to clients who might be on a wait list to see a psychologist, or they're in a rural setting and they can't get access to a psychiatrist or whatever it might be. So we're really keen on the idea that upskilling or providing an additional kind of, workforce option within the mental health care system could actually be a really important way of alleviating a lot of the burden that is not just present now, but the implications of COVID, but financially and socioeconomically are going to be seen now for many years to come.
I mean, I'm incredibly excited. I think it's great that you had the funding for it and that we're supporting this research. How are you recruiting and enrolling people in this research?
So we are really fortunate to have the support of the clinical director at Bowen Health Mental Health Drug and Alcohol Service. So within their existing client base, that's how we are recruiting. So we've set up a really nice model whereby we've seconded a mental health clinician within the service to be working with case managers to talk to them if they think they have existing clients within the program or the service that might benefit from either one of the programs. So it's a largely sort of, I guess, an in-house sort of recruitment strategy. But what I would say is that I'm really pleased to be able to announce that we've also been successful in some subsequent MRFF funding that was just announced on budget night on Tuesday night, actually, led by Professor Michael Burke, the Impact Institute director.
I've heard a lot about.
Yes, so he has been successful in obtaining a $12 million grant to set up a mental health clinical trial network across Australia. And I'm delighted to say that of the 4 signature trials within that funding, one of those will be leading to do something really similar across the primary care space. So the whole idea of that program will be to do exactly what we're doing in public mental health, but outside of Victoria, all across Australia, in every state and territory, in a way that will be set up like we've seen the LIFE program for diabetes within Victoria, where patients will present to their GP. They may well be deemed to be at high risk of diabetes, and GPs can log on to the website and download the referral form into the program. We're hoping to do something similar for this program. So we're hoping that will launch in perhaps early 2022. But yeah, it's hot off the press, so it's still very
fantastic.
Very early days. But I'd be really happy to come back on once that's
that would be wonderful.
Talk more about that.
I mean, I think that you've just described, I mean, obviously passionate researchers like yourself, some very engaged clinicians, but I'm conscious then once you have this information that's potentially very valuable, how you then translate that to other clinicians on the ground, and then again, how they in turn translate that to their patients. I understand you're part of an international task force that is looking maybe exactly to provide some guidelines for clinicians.
Absolutely. So we've been really encouraged I think it was the end of last year, the Productivity Commission in Mental Health released their report, and within that, for, as far as we're aware, the first time they actually identified that lifestyle was both a risk factor and a potential treatment target for mental disorders. So that was sort of, I think, a bit of the first recognition that, okay, this is really starting to get some traction, and they cited some of our work, and that was really, really important, I think. Not long after that, the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists released its latest clinical guidelines for 2020, and that articulated that lifestyle-based mental health care should be deemed non-negotiable, foundational first-line treatment, essentially. So with that, and actually, I would refer any GPs, psychiatrists, psychologists to that document because it does go some way to answering some of those how-to questions. So I think that in the Australian and New Zealand setting, for those clinicians, that document is a really, really great first start. What we are hoping to do with our additional task force, so we've partnered with the World Federations of Society of Biological Psychiatry.
Well done.
It's a bit of a tongue twister. And the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine.
Yes, I'm familiar with, yes.
Yes, yeah. To put together an international task force to broaden what already exists within the College of Psychiatry guidelines, to look beyond the kind of key 4 pillars of lifestyle, being nutrition, exercise, sleep, and substance use, and to go beyond that and look a bit more broadly about some of the emerging pillars, so things like green space, blue space, stress management, things like that. which we
These
know
blue zones.
social, like social prescribing, things that seem to be sort of emerging, but are not perhaps considered. You know, we've spent a long time obviously focusing on getting the recognition for the 4 key pillars. So not only are we sort of broadening that within our international task force, but we also want to go obviously beyond the Australian setting. We also want to reach, I guess, beyond GPs, psychiatrists and psychologists, to also target any health professional who is wanting assistance and guidance in understanding what the evidence is, because we all know that it can be a very, very murky area. So providing that understanding of where the evidence sits and where it doesn't, what the quality and the grading of that evidence is, and then what lifestyle medicine, or I sort of am inclined to call it lifestyle-based mental health care, what that looks like in settings that aren't a well-resourced country or a well-resourced setting, because there's a huge variance in even the application of what we're doing in CALM and our larger trial. There's sort of implications for what that might look like, you know, within any one state when you're looking at rural regions and or what have you. So you can only imagine what that looks like more globally. So we're really hoping to be able to provide some guidance to all healthcare professionals across various settings, and I guess in the absence of well-resourced sort of healthcare systems. So we are hoping to have those published by the end of the year and to make them publicly available. They will be published in a scientific journal, and then we are really hoping to do some training with clinicians on that as well, because then that's obviously the next step. I mean, we all know that just because you produce clinical guidelines doesn't mean that they get taken up. So that's another key piece of the work that we're doing at the Food and Mood Centre, is the education and training stream, which is led by Dr. Tetiana Rox, and she's produced, you know, an online course which has had more than 65,000 individuals enrolled, a 3-week course. It's, you know, and she's very, very passionate about going
I've done that course, yes.
Oh, fantastic. So you would know she's incredibly passionate about, okay, just because the evidence is there doesn't mean it will be taken up. So she's the person that has been creating a lot of our education and training resources. She's working closely with the College of Psychiatrists, and then hoping to partner with other colleges to do CPD training as well, because that's, as you say, we know that, say, in undergrad medicine, for example, that, you know, this type of, I guess, counselling and, say, nutrition education is not always available. And so you've got the self-efficacy of the clinician in terms of what they can do, what they can't do. And then, of course, there's the quality piece as well. So something that I'm really interested in, and this comes largely off the back of some work that I've done in cardiac rehabilitation, and that's a prime example of a structured lifestyle program that has been sort of rolled out within routine clinical care, but the variation in the provision of that type of program is quite high. So, you know, things like quality improvement activities, quality indicators so that clinicians know what they should be collecting, what they should be monitoring, you know, providing resources that can be used. Something that we've done as part of the CALM trial is actually manualise our program. So providing the clinicians providing the program, but also the participant and clients participating in the program, manuals and workbooks, so that there is a degree of what we would call fidelity in terms of what we're intending to deliver, and the quality of that is being delivered, and then sort of recording and assessing that that is the case. Because we know from the diabetes prevention projects that when you go from a largely controlled environment, scaling up a program, if you're not keeping abreast of what is being delivered and the quality of that, things can deviate from best practice pretty quickly, particularly when resources are not always optimal.
And it's so interesting, because I'm taking you back to my introduction, that you're 20 years later, my kind of research was the qualitative component, involving focus groups with patients and general practitioners and cardiologists who were trying to deliver this care. And you know, again, it was just an initial kind of phase at that point. It was probably actually, you know, at a good time, but I'd be curious to see how that has translated in Scotland. I'll have to maybe touch base to see what, you know, where we are. But I think what you describe now is, I mean, I suppose part of me thinks it's a bit disappointing. It's taken 20 years to kind of get to this stage because we kind of known this.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, is that when I, because I do sort of straddle cardiology and chronic disease collaborators, and then of course mental health and psychiatric collaborators, when I talk to where we're at in mental health care to sort of cardiology and diabetes researchers, who are in amazement when I say, gee, we've actually done really well in cardiac rehabilitation, it makes them go, oh gosh, we must be behind in mental health. So I think what I would like to see is that, you know, you and I have been there. We know what has and hasn't worked in that space. And so to retrofit quality improvement and quality indicators and that type of activity, and then tie that to, say, funding reimbursement models, is incredibly difficult to do retrospectively. And that's essentially what many of us in our cardiac rehabilitation have been trying to do. So what I would like to do, and what I'm constantly thinking about as we move forward in a sort of more prospective fashion with the translation of lifestyle-based mental health care, is thinking about all of this right from the beginning, and thinking about, okay, if we find that our CALM model is just as good as a psychotherapy model, and we take those findings to government and, you know, we advocate for policy reform that could enable this type of care to be provided routinely, then what is that quality improvement piece that goes along with that? Well, that has to be embedded within that. Otherwise, you will just end up with this hugely disparate, highly variable sort of model of care that doesn't necessarily, you know, potentially can be diluted in terms of the, you know, its potential effectiveness.
Fantastic. I mean, there's so many things that I would like to talk to you about. So I would actually love if you would come back on. But I did want to, just when we kind of went back into your cardiovascular research, I know this mind-body link, and we haven't really talked about, you know, possible underlying mechanisms of what's going on here. And, you know, I think the commonalities of inflammation and chronic stress, we might talk to, you talked a bit about epigenetics and the microbiome. I read a bit about your research in cardiovascular health and mental health, so the links, and particularly was at work in Victoria, looking at workplace chronic stress and heart rate variability. I'm really fascinated by this area of research. Now, I wonder if you could speak a bit about where you are with that and what you've done in the past.
Absolutely. So one of the major studies that I was involved with as a postdoctoral student was a longitudinal cohort study out of Monash Heart, which is, you know, a large cardiology hospital in the southeast of Melbourne. And we followed up 400 patients who had been hospitalised for a myocardial infarction or a heart event, followed them up over 2 years. We were really interested in teasing out this association between poor mental health after discharge, autonomic functioning or heart rate variability. So, you know, our capacity to sort of rest and digest, as they say, versus the fight or flight. So our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system activities, and who ends up being rehospitalised and who doesn't. And something that I've been interested in is sex-specific disparities in care after discharge for a heart event. We know that women have poorer outcomes, no matter sort of which way you know slice the data. And so something that I was able to investigate was over that 2-year period whether or not heart rate variability was a key driver of those outcomes. So we saw that indeed women tended to have poorer heart rate variability, so their autonomic functioning was, I guess, poorer, which oftentimes, and this is really tricky in interpreting the data. So this was an observational study. We had autonomic functioning at 2 time points. So all we can really say about that was that women had poorer overall autonomic functioning. So whether or not that was their sort of ability to relax, their parasympathetic activity, perhaps wasn't as good as their male counterparts, or that it was that they had elevated distress. And certainly we saw that play out in the data. So there were higher rates of things like phobic anxiety, neuroticism, and depression in women. But again, that's no different to probably what we would see in the general population.
Yeah.
We also saw that women had higher rates of readmission. So I think the bottom line from that project is to say that women seem to have higher rates of distress and depression after a heart event. They seem to have higher rates of readmission up to 3 years follow-up. There's a potential that heart rate variability or autonomic functioning could be playing a role in that, and that's something that really, is a potential mechanism that could be explored further. And this is where cardiac rehabilitation and lifestyle-based therapies could actually play quite a pivotal role. And in fact, one of my colleagues is looking at a yoga-based intervention for women adjunctive to cardiac rehabilitation, because we know that those sorts of interventions target the autonomic system. So
and look, I know this is observational data, there's potential confounders, and you're only trying to, but I think if you could do something, replicate something like the SMILES trial in that kind of setting, it would be quite interesting. So maybe that would be a future, and we'll see that in the future.
Absolutely. Always open to new ideas, that's for sure.
Actually, my next guest on the podcast, this is exactly what we will be exploring, measures of autonomic function and the relationship to particularly workplace well-being. And that's actually with a founder of a company using heart rate variability and other AI markers, initially with athletes in a performance space, and now increasingly working in the healthcare space, in well-being, and also with the military. So I'm really looking forward. I've got a couple of research ideas that are coming to me just as we speak. Maybe you'll get a PhD out of me yet. Thank you so much, Adrienne. I'm enthused by this conversation. Before we go on to the final questions, we had a kind of remit of what we were going to cover today, and I definitely think there's going to need to be an encore. Was there anything else that we haven't covered that you think is important, particularly for this conversation and my audience, about your work?
The only thing that it was remiss of me not to say, but I don't think I made this clear at all, is that both our CALM trial and our larger Million Minds study that's just been funded to start next year are telehealth delivered programs. So they are group-based Zoom delivered programs. And so the potential there, again, in the COVID setting, that was one of the reasons that we employed that platform was, at that stage, Victoria was in the middle of, one of the longest lockdown periods ever seen in the world. We weren't sure if and when we were going to be able to have face-to-face contact with our participants, and clinicians didn't know, when they would be doing that with their clients. So we deliberately employed a telehealth delivered model for the initial sort of lockdown period. But increasingly, with the uptake of telehealth and the MBS item numbers supporting that and the extension of that, it's looking like this sort of a model I think it's going to be important data that we are going to be generating from both of those studies. And it will also allow for us to bring these programs to the masses. So if you've got, you know, a device and internet access, then, you know, you may well be eligible for our large trial when we go national through GP clinics. So I think that I just wanted to make mention of that.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And, you know, so where can we find out more about your work and the work of the Food and Mood Centre? And are there links to some of the other resources that you've described?
Absolutely. So I can send through to you the links for the Food and Mood Centre to Impact, and also the most recent funding announcement as well. So for anyone that wants to know more about the CALM trial, which is our trial within public mental health care, it's Food and Mood Centre, all one word, lowercase, .com.au, and then follow the links from projects through to the CALM trial.
Yeah. And I mean, I would love to have you get back on, but what we can do is update the show notes with the guidelines. Now, I read Professor Felice Jacka's book, Brain Changer. We talk a lot about books on this podcast as well. I would love to know, what are you reading at the moment, or is there any particular books that you would recommend to my audience around the themes that we've discussed?
Oh, that is a very good question.
Or anything else. We just love books, to be honest.
Well, yeah. Well, I must say that, one, I'm incredibly biased because I do work with Professor Jacka, but also this probably shows where I'm at in terms of my headspace. I have a 3-year-old boy at home, and so we're reading There's a Zoo in My Poo, which is Professor Jacka's children's book, animated by her partner Rob Craw. So for anyone with kids out there,
wonderful.
It's a fantastic education tool for kids. I mean, thinking about, you know, our role as parents in the food environment, and, you know, it is incredibly challenging when you have young children. And so I think the whole idea of educating them about the fun aspects, and, you know, it's a little bit cheeky because it says poo and things like that. So that's probably my recommendation at the moment.
There's going to be so many people that will be downloading that one. That's fantastic. I actually didn't know about that, so that'll be my next read. Great. And look, I'd like to finish with some, you know, I mean, your passion for your subject and how engaged you are in this is, you know, I mean, it's just, you can see even through a screen, and I'm so grateful that we have people like you who are doing great work in this area. But I am conscious that, you know, when you have a passion like that, it can become all consuming. And we do talk a lot about our own health and well-being on this podcast. So I'd love to just finish with a couple of questions just about, you know, you personally, and maybe things that you've taken from your experiences. So the first one's, you know, is what well-being actually means to you. Do you have a working definition for yourself?
Yeah. I think for me, I don't necessarily have a working definition of well-being, but I think I've become increasingly aware since I've been in this space of the genuine utility of the messages that we are trying to send to, you know, the community in terms of the effectiveness of these strategies. I know for myself that I use particularly exercise, adjunctive to pharmacotherapy, to manage my mental health. I've had a long history of depression over many, many years, and as soon as I start to drop off in terms of, you know, perhaps not eating as well as I should be, or not, I've always loved running, which I'm really lucky because I know that there's not a lot of people that would say that, but I noticed.
You're talking to a lot of people who love running on this body. You're on the right podcast. I'm
very conscious that there's a lot of people that just look at me when I say that and just go, oh.
Not on this space.
So I would say that it's obvious and it's palpable to me that when I'm sort of essentially not practicing what I'm preaching, that's when I start to see a deterioration in my mental health. So I just think that it's just part of my lifestyle now. I've always been someone that has been quite firm with boundaries in terms of things like working long hours, because again, it's that whole thing of you're not practicing what you're preaching if you're sitting at your desk on your computer for 12, 13 hours a day. So I'm really aware that particularly and I'm sure it's the same in your line of work, but in the academic setting, burnout is really high. So I'm very, very clear on that. And I just think social support, when you've got a young family, they don't care if you've got a deadline. They just want you to play with them. So I think sometimes it's just being kind to yourself, and understanding that, if you're getting pulled away to go and play at the playground or what have you, and getting pulled away from work, that, that's probably actually going to be a good thing. So I guess it really, I hate to sound cliche, but it really
it was very articulate.
It just really is about sort of that balance, which not everyone is able to do. I know that particularly there's a lot of professions where it's very, very difficult to do. And so I think having flexibility in a workplace to allow for that work-life balance or for family time is really, really important.
And I mean, I think you've already started to speak to this, any tools and strategies that you use when you are struggling or challenged or busy. You've mentioned a few. Do you have any other kind of go-to?
Yeah, I just think remembering to do activities that make us happy, no matter how little or brief it might just be, putting on music or walking your dog, and it's no different to what I would say when we're sort of, I guess, developing the sorts of interventions that I've been talking about today, is that everyone's got their own way of sort of, I guess, achieving peace. And I guess just being mindful of that, because it's so easy. And I think 2020 has encouraged us all to think about exactly that. And I think when things like having the opportunity to go to the beach when you want, or walk around the block and put music on when you want, when that's sort of essentially been taken away from you, it allows you, I think it's allowed us all to re-examine what it is. It's the simple things a lot of the time that are the most important to us.
I think you've probably already described your ideal self-care Sunday. That's the term we've coined. What would it involve? I can already imagine.
Oh, yes. So I'm a big sleeper. That is something. So I love a sleep in. And to get up and walk the dog with my family and go for breakfast, and then, do some cooking to get ready for the week, and maybe shoot out for a run and see a movie. I love our local cinema here in Yarraville in Melbourne. Is a beautiful old Art Deco building, and has some it has some wonderful movies on. Catching up with family. I'm very, very close with my family. So, and then maybe watching a bit of football, because I'm also a bit sports mad.
Perfect. So. And you just mentioned a bit of cooking there. I mean, we have talked about food and mood, and we've mentioned Michael Pollan's take on it. But, do you have any food rules to live by based on, your extensive research?
Well, I think everything that Felice has previously said about absolutely kind of keeping it simple. I know that she lives by the sort of 80-20 rule, where you sort of try and have the foundations of a really good diet, but, there are going to be times, whether it's based on low mood or just you haven't got to the shops, or you're disorganised, or you get caught out at an airport or something like that. I guess just giving ourselves permission to, that you're not going to be perfect all of the time, and erring on that side is not always the most helpful anyhow. So I would really just echo what she says, so that the variety in diet, finding things that you actually enjoy eating, is all really, really important.
Great. I think I subscribed to that. And moderation, and everything in moderation, including moderation at times. So 80-20 is good. Thank you again, Adrienne. It's been a real pleasure and joy speaking to you this morning. Your enthusiasm and your passion for your subject really does shine through. And, you've got extensive expertise. And I'm really excited to see where the next few years will take this research and its translation. I'm going to put a link to all the references that we've discussed here, the Smiles Trial, the Food and Mood Centre, the Impact, and some of the more updated research studies that you're recruiting for. In addition to Professor Felice Jacka's book Brain Changer, which I highly recommend. And now I've got a new one for the book list. There's a zoo in my poo. So that's fantastic. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did recording it. I spoke at the beginning of this podcast project last year that, when we're thinking about pillars of health, well-being and performance, that, we think in terms of the science and then the art of practice and then this ancient wisdom that lies between. And, I think it is important, and I feel very strongly as a clinician that we need to seek the best evidence available, particularly in terms of scientific rigour. But I'm very aware that, more often than not, there's many limitations to that in practice, particularly when we're talking about lifestyle interventions. It's great that we have some people like Adrienne doing some very robust research, but I think she speaks very well about the application and the problems with application of that, even when you do have, a good degree of scientific rigor. You have to think about the resources and tools available to communities and individuals, and you really have to work in that space. And I think that we can take that to our own application of, what we know is probably good for us, but how we apply that in a day-to-day, our day-to-day lives. And I think that's a constant work in progress, certainly for me, as an individual and not with my doctor hat on. So I'm delighted over this season, we'll be talking to a couple of other scientists who are also clinicians, and talk about how they translate their science and research evidence into their clinical practice. I'm pleased to have mentioned that Dr. Brendan Stubbs will be on to talk about his work in exercise application in mental health as a physio and leading academic researcher in psychiatry. But next week, as I've mentioned, we're going to be speaking to Tal Brown, who is the founder of Zone 7. And his company is using artificial intelligence and other AI tools. They have been using it more in a performance setting with athletes. But, fascinatingly, from my perspective, have moved into other working environments and particularly working with healthcare professionals. So, I'm looking forward to talking tech with Tal. I hope you can join us next week.
It's obvious and it's palpable to me that when I'm sort of essentially not practicing what I'm preaching, that's when I start to see a deterioration in my mental health. So I just think that it's just part of my lifestyle now. I've always been someone that has been quite firm with boundaries in terms of things like working long hours, because again, it's that whole thing. If you're not practicing what you're preaching, if you're sitting at your desk on your computer for 12, 13 hours a day. So I'm really aware that particularly and I'm sure it's the same in your line of work, but in the academic setting, burnout is really high. So I'm very, very clear on that. And I just think social support, when you've got a young family, they don't care if you've got a deadline. They just want you to play with them. So I think sometimes it's just being kind to yourself and understanding that if you're getting pulled away and to go and play at the playground or what have you.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are, at this very minute, experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.